As someone that is not in what I would consider to be a very liturgical church, and in my personal history, I, for the first 27, 28 years of my life, had a very symbolic view of communion as opposed to a sacramental view of communion. I'm fascinated by churches that hold different views. So this week, the ecumenical patriarchate of and apparently patriarchate is the office of the patriarch of the Greek Orthodox Church. But so the Greek Orthodox Church has come out and said each individual priest in the United States has the authority to decide what is the best way to administer communion to their church during this time, whether that's communion online, whether that's we're going to give you stuff in a Ziploc baggie, whether that's I'm going to stick it directly onto your tongue, whatever it may be. Each individual priest has that right, which is huge in the Greek Orthodox Church, that they have kind of made that concession to know that each ministry context is different, so each priest ministering to them can be faithful, quote, to the Mother Church of Constantinople for all her spiritual children throughout the world, and by doing what is in the best conscience of the priest. And then in the Catholic Church, they are trying to promote this idea of the return of ocular communion, which I've never heard of ocular communion before because I've never taken communion with my eyeballs. But it's the idea that for the vast majority of the history of the Roman Catholic Church, before Martin Luther, the idea of an individual parishioner receiving the Eucharist each and every week was not the case. And most weeks, if it wasn't Christmas, Easter, or Pentecost, the parishioners would watch the priest take communion. And the doctrine that they were taught was, well, you witnessing this counts. And so now what we're doing online, you watching the priest at Mass, that counts as your communion, which I don't think that's where any of us would line up on our views of communion. But it's just fascinating to me because that's a conversation that we're having once a month. Hey, what do we do this month about communion? Last month was our first Sunday back meeting in person, and we take communion on the first Sunday of the month, and it was, okay, do you know what? We're not going to take communion this month. We spent 2 months doing communion online, which was, hey, you can either come pick up your elements here at the church, or you can go pick up something of your own. And now that our numbers have spiked in our area, this coming Sunday is a communion Sunday, and we're once again saying, what are we doing this week about communion? So my question to you guys is, anybody practicing ocular communion? Anybody just saying we're not going to take communion for a little while? Or what are we doing?
Yeah, we did a drive-through communion experience when we were not gathering on Sundays, and that is the last time we have taken communion as a church. And that was back in April. So we have not brought it back yet. We purchased all the nasty prepackaged stuff, so we have it. We just have not administered communion yet. So I'm kind of right there. We're still wrestling with it as a leadership team. We opted not to do it this Sunday, which would have been a communion Sunday for us. So we just have not gone back to it yet.
Same here. We did ours was like in March was our last one we did. And then the theological ditches go so wild. There's a couple groups online. Y'all probably know them. If you just go in there and say, what about my communion? It will get nasty really fast. So we're, just to be honest, with so many other things melting down around us right now, we're like, do we want to add that to the melting pot? I will say this though, every week we have to load in and load out. And this week I've got the prepackaged. By the way, you are right with that adjective, man. That stuff is nasty.
Oh, it's gross.
That thing holds like an MRE, bro. That thing will not expire. I'm telling you. But I think that this week I am going to get my load-in team. Because it's about 20 of us, 15, 20 of us on a great day. And I'm just going to have a little beforehand with us, just so that way, because we are fellowshipping. But as far as in part of the whole church, that has not been pulled back in on the conversations yet.
So for us, and I would just say before, like, as we're having this conversation, I assume that for all of us, the method or mode of communion is a second-handed issue. Whether or not we do communion is probably more of a close-handed issue. Like, we should do it. How often we do it, the way we do it, that's more secondhand or open hand. So I tend to be a little more or sacramental in how I think about the nature of what communion is. I would recommend, there's a book called A Holy Meal by Gordon T. Smith. That is a really great read. It's a good first read. If you come from more of a just symbolic background, which that's the background I come from, more low church, evangelical, middle of the road. How often do you guys all do communion? Is it once a month for most of you?
Once a month.
Yeah.
Yeah, once a month.
Yeah. So that's the traditions I've grown up in. I have grown a conviction that it should be every week. So when I came here as pastor, the first week that was one of the very first thing I changed is we're taking communion every week. And I was able to work through all the questions about won't it become old and rote and all that. And maybe that's another good discussion for another day. But in terms of online communion, I do think that, and again, this is open-handed, so I don't think that it's sin to not do what I'm saying. But for us, we haven't taken communion since we stopped having in-person services, which was March the 8th was our last service. And we take it every week. So it's something that is a central part of our service. But at the same time, for me, the nature of what's happening in communion, I struggle with making sense of that online. Having said that, I think there's a deeper conversation about what it means to be present with one another. And I do think you can be present with one another like this. So I'm a little bit, I'm not sure about it. And because I'm not sure, we're sticking with not doing it. We had we did do communion on Good Friday. And that was online, and we did it on Zoom, and it was weird. Yeah. The nature of what communion is, that it's, for me, you're visibly seeing the body of Christ, not in the elements, but in God's people gathered together. I think that's pretty tough to pull off online. And I do think that there's something special happening in that moment. I don't believe in transubstantiation. And part of the reason we're not doing it every week is because we literally had a conversation about not wanting to do ocular communion.
Mm-hmm.
So, and, Frank, you'll remember this, but there are some Catholic traditions where at the moment of Eucharist, they will say, hold it higher. And that's a leftover from that medieval practice where the people in the back literally thought, you got to hold it higher so I can see the priest breaking the bread and pouring the cup. So I struggle with it. I would rather not do it. I think the church, there's a sense in which we are experiencing a form of exile. And if you look at exile in the Old Testament, there's things that the people of God cannot do while they're in exile. They can't go to the temple. They can't, have a tabernacle. So there's a sense in which we get to experience some of that. Again, having said that, I think if churches are doing communion online, do it well. It's just not, for us, it's not. And I'm a communion every week guy.
I've been at a church where we did communion every week and absolutely loved it. And again, I find myself moving more and more to a sacramental view of communion. But with that
book will be
I've read bits and pieces of it, so enough to prove a point, not enough to actually sit down and read it because I'm a jerk. But the idea of communion being sacramental, and in that, not that there's any thing mystical or magical about the elements in and of themselves, but by being obedient to Christ, you are receiving grace simply by being obedient to what Christ has commanded us to do as a church. But also with that, the idea of the priesthood of believers. So because I'm the one with the piece of paper on my wall and 3 letters in front of my name, that doesn't make me any more entitled or authoritative to bless a piece of bread or juice for that use. And so one thing that we encouraged was, hey, yes, we're doing communion, and we're in Florida. We have a lot of empty nesters. We have a lot of older people living alone, but we also have a lot of families at our church. And so we said, for communion, take communion as a family. Mom or dad, you lead the serving of communion to your believing children and make it a special thing like that, because you have just as much priesthood as I do. Which sounds, when I say it like that, I sound very Mormon. You have priesthood, you have priesthood, you have priesthood, which is not quite what I was going for. It just came out that way. But so the idea that, yes, this is a sacramental thing. This is not just a symbolic piece of bread. This is something that Christ commanded us to do, but he commanded you to do it. He commanded me to do it, and he commanded us to do it.
I love, Jeff, what you said about how we're kind of in a form of exodus, or in a form of exile, rather. I mean, summarize. We've had these like really highly conversations from a theological and a practical standpoint in our church, and my position was, there's churches in China and the Middle East who are going through persecution, who desperately want to be a part of participating in different sacraments, and they figure out a way. And I believe there's grace for them in their circumstances for them to have communion. And I think that, like, kind of Jeff, your position is similar. Is like, if churches are doing it, there's grace for them. As long as you don't feel like there's any conviction that you're doing it wrong, I think you're fine. But if there's a conviction that, like, I'm compromising, I'm doing something weird or whatever, then I think that's a sin for you, according to like what Scripture says. Where, like, if it feels like a sin, then it probably is a sin due to your conscience. But I think there's grace, and so I think, man, that was really good. I appreciate. I'm going to use that phrase. We as a church are in exile right now.